The journey to Algonquin Park had been a long one. The drive took the better part of the morning. I'd packed the car the night prior and hit the road before sunup. I would arrive just before noon after a grueling 6-hour drive, and even after all that, my journey was only beginning. I was exhausted and a little scared, but I told myself it would be worth it. Only a handful of people had done what I was about to do. Apparently, some had tried and never made it back home, but I was convinced that I would be one of the fortunate few who made it back safely from the bothy. I paused the Mr. Ballin podcast I was listening to as I pulled up to the little wooden shack situated at the center of the gravel road. "Have you been to the park before?" the woman at the entrance gate asked me. I looked at her name tag, seeing it read Helen Park Ranger. "Once or twice," I said back, a little white lie. "A few dozen times would be more accurate." "Okay, don't forget to stop by the visitor center for a map. It's a little ways up on the road to your right. Enjoy your visit." "Thanks," I said. "Have a good one." Talking to people was a necessary evil when it came to this initial registration phase at the park. I didn't relish the prospect of conversation with yet another stranger. Strangers make me feel uncomfortable, nervous. I always smile at them too big and too awkwardly, and I can sense their discomfort as it grows, feeding off my own. I've always been a bit of a lone wolf, and the idea of spending over a week alone in the wilderness didn't scare me, it excited me. I couldn't wait to get away from everyone. I drove up the gravel road and eventually found the log building which served as the visitor center. Parking in a small lot outside, I went in. The place was empty aside from a lone employee. A chubby older man with a goatee and a bald head stood up to greet me. He was wearing glasses and a tan-colored park ranger shirt and had been staring blankly at the wall before I entered, as far as I could tell. "Hey there, how you doing, fella?" he said, looking happy to have a visitor during a quiet day. "Elliot Marsh, I'm one of the park staff around here. Beautiful weather for a camping trip, wouldn't you say?" "Ha! Looks like I got campsite 94F, I said, fumbling for my camping permit, then waving it at him awkwardly. I winced inwardly at my lack of social skills, not for the first time. "Of course," he beamed, reaching to grab a folded pamphlet-style map from under the counter. "These come free of charge with your entry fee. This one will show you an overview of the whole park, but you really need the blown-up version for whatever area you're heading into." He grabbed another map from behind the counter after searching for a few moments through a stack of laminated pages. "Okay, so you'll be up in this area," he said, showing me the waterproof piece of paper with a hand-drawn map on it. "These are all made up by park rangers by hand, so they aren't 100% accurate, but you get the idea when you get out there. Like I said, the big map doesn't show enough detail. You get lost if you try to go just using that, so don't." He handed the page across the counter to me and began to outline the route I would be taking. He drew on the map in water-soluble ink since it was laminated, then told me I would need to return it to him at the end of my portaging trip. "Careful with your fingers on the map. You don't want to accidentally erase my lines, or you'll have to go by memory." "Oh yeah, wouldn't want that," I said, hoping my voice sounded even. I had no intention of even looking at the map. This was all just for appearances. I made for the canoe launch and loaded up the boat, setting off into the water. "Have a good time out there. Stay safe." The guy called after me, and I winced at the loudness of his voice. It would be so nice to be away from him, to be away from everyone. The canoe wobbled for a few seconds as I adjusted my weight getting in, but then I got used to the feeling of balancing myself, and everything settled. Pushing off with my paddle, I plunged into the shallow water and was off, gliding serenely across the lake. My paddle cut through the crystal clear water like a knife, making little whirlpools and eddies as I sped along with my swift strokes. I had been canoeing since I was a kid, and it felt like it no longer took any effort. My muscles had been built for this after so many years. I could paddle for days and probably would, at least while I was out here. The campsite was just a formality. I had no intention of actually using it except maybe for a night. My intention was to head out far past the traditional camping areas. I wanted to find something out there, and that meant going where most people never traveled. I hadn't told anyone the real reason why I was coming here, my secret obsession for the last year and a half. I guess I should start off by explaining that I've been obsessed with anything to do with the supernatural for my entire life, reading horror novels, watching horror movies, but so much more than that. I religiously watched documentaries and videos about paranormal phenomena. Real-life stories and videos of things that couldn't be rationally explained always fascinated me the most. UFOs, ghosts, paranormal entities, and portals to other dimensions all held their share of mystery, but the thing that really caught my attention was when I found out about the Balthi maybe 18 months ago. There were posts online, tucked between threads about Bloody Bobby and the sewer spiders of Louisville, which spoke about a hidden place far out in the woods, deep within Algonquin's wilderness. No one knew who built it there, but there were pictures of the cabin, even a few videos taken from the exterior, and there were stories, unbelievable stories. People warned against going there, but my curiosity had gotten the better of me. I wanted to see it for myself, to find out once and for all if there really was anything to this mystery, or if it was all a hoax. And it helped that the cabin happened to be located in my favorite provincial park, the one I'd been going to since I was a small child. As I paddled along, I let my thoughts drift and my mind wander. I watched the pine trees along the shore and admired the birds taking off from the branches. I'd see fish swimming in the shallow water and bass jumping into the air. Occasionally, I'd glimpse deer in the distance every so often, standing on the banks of the water drinking from the lake or eating the foliage which grew everywhere, and I was reminded again of how beautiful this place was, how privileged I was to be able to visit here so easily. Eventually, I made it to the first portage and brought the canoe up onto the shore with an effort. It was pretty heavy, loaded up with food, gear, and water as it was, but I told myself it would be lighter on the way back. I walked the distance back and forth along the path between lakes 3 times to bring all the equipment in the canoe. I took a short break for lunch before setting off again. The afternoon grew warm, and I took off my shirt as I paddled along, enjoying the breeze on my skin. Mosquitoes were plentiful, but as long as I kept moving, they didn't seem to land on me too often. A couple of portages later, I finally arrived at my campsite just as the evening was beginning to turn to night, happy with the progress I'd made that day. I was excited to begin my journey the next morning in earnest, setting out for the wilderness beyond any of the campsites offered to visitors. I would set up my tent wherever I could find a spot, and I planned on visiting several different locations along the way, each of which I had thoroughly researched. Before going to sleep, I knew I had to take precautions with my food. I bundled everything up in a bag and took it a little ways away from my campsite. Then I tied a rope around the top of the bag and hung it from a tree branch, elevating it about 12 feet into the air. The heavy bag swung suspended from the branch, and I tied off the rope with a sturdy knot. After a moment of admiring my handiwork, I nodded to myself, satisfied. Bears were plentiful in the backcountry of Algonquin Park, and you had to keep yourself safe. If you just put the food in your tent, it would attract bears to you, and they would likely try to get inside. Likewise, if you were eating and left any food garbage in or around the tents, the bears would get to it. That had happened to me as a kid when I went to Algonquin. I had forgotten a box of mac and cheese in my bag when we went for a swim. When we got back to the campsite, the bag was torn to pieces, and the mac and cheese was everywhere. Apparently, the crunchy pasta hadn't been to the bears' liking, but I had learned from my mistakes. That night I slept easily in my tent, not worried about a thing. I was so confident, so self-assured, but I should have been scared. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, or I would have been terrified. The following 2 days were uneventful, so I won't bore you with the details of them. The only thing worth mentioning was that the fishing was terrible, and the foraging was worse. The season was right for everything, but it was like my road was poisoned. My trajectory was heading for that cursed cabin in the woods, and every creature in Algonquin seemed to realize it. Birds flew away when they saw me coming. Deer averted their gaze before disappearing into the brush, and every time I cast my line into the water, the fish swam away as if the bait were made of stone. Still, I continued undeterred. I lived off my provisions, telling myself that I would find food further in, telling myself it was okay, even when I was beginning to notice that it wasn't. By the fourth day, I was starting to realize I was in potential trouble, but the cabin wasn't far off, and I was determined to see my journey through to the end. I had emergency rations I could dig into if it came down to it, so I wasn't too worried about food. I told myself I'd be okay. People can survive days without food after all. It would be slightly scary, but I would make it. Instead of thinking about that, I tried to focus on the beauty of the wilderness around me, but instead of majesty, all I could make out was the macabre. Rotting vegetation, mosquitoes buzzing around the corpse of something on the shore, carrion birds feasting on the decayed flesh and pulling strips of gristle from the body. Dark clouds rolled in overhead, casting the lake in shadow. The woods were so quiet now, the water so still, as I paddled in eerie silence. The lake turned into a marsh, as the posts online promised that it would, and the bugs came out quickly to feast on me, basking in the darkness of the cloud cover like tiny vampires. Mosquitoes and black flies were landing on me moments after I entered the swamp, and I paddled quicker, trying to get through. I knew I was very close to my destination now. It was only a matter of minutes before I arrived there. When the cabin finally came into view out of the mist, I let out a sigh of relief. It was really there. Part of me had worried it would all be a hoax, as unlikely as that might be. You never knew when you were going somewhere like this based on something posted online, whether or not it was truly real, especially when it was something as steeped in legend and mythos as this cabin was. But there it was, growing visible more and more as I drifted closer in the canoe, no longer caring that mosquitoes were sucking my blood and black flies were biting me. After all that effort, I was finally here. The small cabin's details became clearer as I got closer and found a spot to land my canoe. I brought it up onto the shore, then flipped it over so it wouldn't slide down the slope, leaving me stranded there. I was eager to get inside, away from the bugs, but I still took a moment to admire the squat little building standing alone out here, so far away from any other signs of civilization. Bullfrogs were croaking, and crickets had begun to chirp, and I realized that it was getting dark. I'd been so focused on finding the cabin at the end of my journey, I'd almost paddled right through dusk, which is when I usually would have set up camp, if not long before that. I'd been pushing my limits trying to reach the place in more ways than one, but I was finally there. An old canoe was lying nearby, looking weathered and worn with holes in its hull. I wondered for a second what the story was behind its presence, and why it had been abandoned there. The front steps creaked loudly as I climbed them, trying the front door to find it unlocked. It swung open with a rusted groan on its hinges, and I stepped inside the cabin. A second after going inside, I heard something like footsteps, almost as if someone were going out the back door as I was going in the front. I listened carefully for a few seconds, and the sound faded away, the light padding of feet on grass dying in the night. Had someone been camping here right before I arrived? Had I scared them away just now? My heart was pounding at the thought, and if so, I kind of felt terrible as well. It was getting dark outside and nobody should be out there right now. "Hey, it's okay," I called out. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just came here to camp for the night." Nobody answered, and I suddenly felt foolish. I told myself I'd been imagining things. There probably wasn't anyone else here. It was just an echo or my mind playing tricks on me. The front door had a deadbolt, and I used it. Then I went with my flashlight from room to room, looking for any signs of habitation. There was nobody there and no signs of anyone's personal possessions. There was a little fireplace and a stockroom with a surprising number of canned food items inside. In Scotland, they called places like this a bothy. I'd learned through my research, and that was what I had come to call it myself. They were more common in other parts of the world, but not frequently seen in Canada, where I live. Essentially, it was just a hut in the middle of the wilderness meant to serve as an overnight shelter for hikers. The only difference was this particular bothy had a reputation, a bizarre non-history. It had no origins to speak of. No one knew who had constructed it or when. It had seemingly just appeared out of nothing, with the earliest record of it being a few years ago, despite its age looking much older. Plenty of wood and kindling was stacked inside beside the fireplace, and I didn't have to worry about that, at least for tonight. I also noticed that the back door was closed and deadbolted from inside, which meant that I had definitely imagined the sound of footsteps earlier. There was no way someone could have pulled a deadbolt across from the outside. It had to be done from within the cabin. A piece of old paper was lying flat on the dining room table near the back door, and I went over to examine it, curious. A rock was holding it down, keeping it from being blown away by the breeze. As I looked it over, a smile began to spread across my face at the practical joke. No one had mentioned this in any of the posts I'd read. It was a list of rules for the cabin, but they were obviously a prank, a jest being played by the last occupant of the cabin on any newcomers. The weather-worn look of the paper had to be fake, since this list reminded me more of a creepypasta story than an actual list someone had written that long ago. The rules read as follows. Rule number 1. You must share your knowledge of the cabin with others. More visitors are required to sustain its hunger. Rule number 2. Lock all doors when inside the cabin. When you are permitted to leave, the door will lock behind you, ensuring compliance. Rule number 3. Canned goods must be removed from the pantry before use and will be replenished daily. Do not return half-used items to the pantry under any circumstances. Feed all refuse, including cans and leftovers, into the fireplace. The cabin will consume them readily. Rule number 4. The above rule also applies to wood and kindling, as well as lantern oil, cutlery, and other disposables. These will likewise be replenished daily, and leftovers must be deposited into the fireplace. Under no circumstances should half-finished items be kept out of the pantry room overnight. Rule number 5. Knocking on doors and windows should be expected from the hours of 3:00 a.m. to 4:00 a.m. Do not open doors or windows during these times. Do not respond to the voices or answer their questions. Rule number 6. You may not leave the cabin until a new visitor arrives. The cabin must have constant sustenance. This last one made my skin crawl for some reason. I didn't like the vibes I was feeling in this place, especially after hearing the sounds of footsteps earlier, but I also didn't have anywhere else to go. It's just someone's stupid idea of a prank, I told myself. The list is just a dumb joke, and the footsteps were an audible hallucination brought on by too many days alone with no one to talk to. That makes a lot of sense, said a voice inside my head that was not my own. What the hell? I nearly screamed. The sensation of having someone else speaking inside my head was so foreign and unpleasant, it was absolutely horrifying. I didn't understand how it was possible, or if it was even possible. Maybe I was losing my mind. The prospect frightened me more than a little bit. I waited for the voice inside my head to say something else, but it didn't, and I was thankful for that. I didn't want to try opening the doors after that, because I was still telling myself that the list was a joke, that I was imagining things and just needed some food and a good night's rest. So I went into the pantry room and grabbed a can of beans from the shelf. After checking the expiration date, I heated up the beans directly in the can, setting it on top of the stove as the wood inside the fireplace crackled and burned. Frightened I would hear the voice in my head speaking again, I was jittery and anxious all night. I played games on my phone for a while, trying to distract myself, but I wasn't getting any cell reception, and definitely no data signal to watch anything. Finally, bored and tired from the long journey, I prepared myself to go to sleep. I unfurled my sleeping bag and curled up inside of it, feeling a knot of dread growing inside my belly. It felt like I was forgetting something very important, but I had no idea what it might be. And as I drifted off into nightmares, the half-finished can of beans sitting next to me in the darkness began to rattle and shake, something awful growing inside of it. At some point during the night, I woke up to the sound of tapping, a soft rapping at the windows that was steady and annoying. I moaned and began to sit up in my sleeping bag, my mind fuzzy with sleep. "Who's in there?" A raspy voice was whispering. "Let us in," said a second voice, this one near the front door. "It's so cold," said a third voice from just behind me, causing me to jump with fright. There was a boarded-up window behind where I was sleeping, and the voice was speaking to me through the layers of wood and glass, but for a second, it had sounded like it was right there inside the room with me. I opened my mouth, maybe to scream, I'm not sure, but I stopped short as something caught my eye. The can of beans just beside me was moving. It was jiggling and then tipped over as something began to crawl out of it. I nearly puked as I turned on the light from my phone and took in the details of it. The thing looked like a grub, a giant brown shiny grub, the kind Bear Grylls would eat if he'd been stuck outside for too long or was just trying to show off for the cameras. Something shifted inside my stomach, squirming. Again, I nearly threw up as I thought about the fact that I had eaten beans out of the can just a few hours prior. Had there been bugs inside the can even then? Judging by the lurching in my stomach, it sure seemed like it. "Let us in," a dry voice wailed from the front door. A soft sound like fingernails scratching the wood came next. I opened my mouth to say something, I wasn't sure what, when the voice inside my head spoke again. "I really wouldn't do that. Do you need to read that list of rules again?" This time there was no convincing myself that it was my own voice inside my head. This was clearly some other entity speaking to me. I had totally forgotten about the rules at that point after all, but now they came flooding back into my mind. I had broken the rule about leaving cans out overnight. I was supposed to do what exactly? I had skimmed the list because it seemed so dumb, but now my life depended on it. The voice in my mind sighed. "Maybe you should throw the can in the fire and don't answer the voices. Remember, you do know how to read, don't you?" "Yes, I know how to read," I hissed. "Who the hell are you?" How am I hearing your voice inside my head? The ghouls outside stopped scratching at the doors and windows with their fingernails and listened, as if curious. "I think you know who I am. You read the posts online. They all said the same thing. The cabin is alive. You just didn't want to believe it." "Of course I didn't want to believe it. That's impossible. This is impossible." A long silence. "Are you going to eat those grubs?" "Because if you are, that's okay, but if not, I'd really like to have them." I stood up and grabbed the can of beans, flicking one of the grubs back inside. "Can't believe I'm doing this. This is a nightmare." I went to throw the can into the waste bin, but then the voice began to speak again. "Into the fire, remember? You really need to read that list again, assuming you can read." I scoffed, turned around, and threw the can into the fireplace, which was now completely dead, the fire long extinguished. Part of me wanted to make a smart remark, but the moment I threw the can into the stove, the whole thing lit up in a bright white gout of flame. I saw an inhuman face in the flames for a split second, a skull-like face with hollow holes for eyes and a hungry grin, and then the fire was out again, and the face was gone. The can, too. The unpleasant feeling in my gut went away with it. "Ah, that's better," said the deep voice inside my head. "Now the cutlery, throw it in as well." I hadn't even thought about the cheap disposable wooden cutlery, but now that I looked at it closely, I saw it was covered in tiny insects. Ants or termites, perhaps. "Do it quickly now, otherwise they'll get inside." The door handle started rattling and shaking as the people outside began trying to force their way in. The tapping on the windows turned into pounding fists, angry and insistent. I went over to the wooden fork and spoon on the floor and picked them up, holding them between two fingers as if they were diseased. Then I tossed them into the fireplace. The fire flared up again, but less this time, and then dwindled down to a low, flickering candle burn. Good. You've done well for a first-timer. Only one last thing, lantern oil. Toss it in as well, quickly now. They're almost inside. It took me a few seconds to find where I had put the bottle of lantern oil. I'd used it to refill the kerosene lanterns the night prior, but I couldn't remember where I had set it down. Finally, my eyes settled on it, sitting atop the dining table near the list of rules. I ran over to it and picked up the mostly full bottle. A voice in my mind, not the new one, was screaming that this was dangerous, that what I was doing should not be done under any circumstances. It was reckless and stupid and entirely necessary. Don't do this at home, kids, let me tell you. It wasn't smart, but I threw the bottle of lantern oil into the fireplace, then scrambled backwards, flipping over the dining table and hiding behind it for cover. I was expecting an explosion or fireball like something out of a Die Hard movie, but instead it just flared up in a bright orange light and dissipated a moment later. That was good. Thank you, the voice in my head said. A few moments later, the people outside stopped trying to get in. The noises quieted, and all was still and silent again, except for the voice in my head that didn't belong. You did just as I asked. Thank you, well done. You'll make an excellent pet. And with those words, I fainted. I woke up the next morning with a ringing in my ear and a painful headache. The back of my skull was hurting. When I reached back there, I felt a large goose egg as well as a lot of dried blood. My hair was crispy with it. I groaned, sitting up and telling myself that I'd fallen last night, and that was why I had such horrible nightmares. The voice in my head, the grubs and the beans, the people trying to get in. Looking towards where the can of beans should have been, I felt the bile rising in my throat. The can was gone, and there were several carcasses of dead, shriveled grubs lying near it, big fat ones, just like I'd seen in my nightmare. Yeah, sorry, that wasn't a nightmare. I mean, sure, you did have a few of those too, but the really horrible stuff, that actually happened. The voice in my head spoke again. It took me a long time before I could talk. My jaw just hung down stupidly, and I stared around the interior of the cabin, looking for the source of the voice and knowing I wouldn't find it. It wasn't audible after all. It was in my own mind. Who are you? I asked aloud, my voice trembling. What do you want from me? Oh, I think you know the answer to that already. Just think about it. I thought about it and he was right. I was starting to think of the voice as a he because it sounded like a man. The voice was different from my own. You're the cabin, right? I asked. Bingo? First guess and you got it right, although I can't award you any points because you didn't present your answer in the form of a question. Best of luck on your next answer. This thing certainly had a sense of humor, demented as it was. Demented. Hey, that stings, man. I didn't call you names after the show you put on for me last night. I thought back. Hey, you saw that? What the hell, I need to do that before bed, or I can't fall asleep. It's not my fault. The voice scoffed. You humans, so weak. Okay, let's get back to the question, Caleb. My name's not. I started, but he cut me off. Very funny. Okay, so what do you want from me? Look at the list, Caleb boy, it's all right there in front of you. I'm not hiding anything. I stumbled back over towards the list, my legs not working correctly. This all felt too weird, like I was still dreaming, but I knew I wasn't. It was all too real. Scanning the list of rules, my eyes settled on number 6. You may not leave the cabin until a new visitor arrives. The cabin must have constant sustenance. What the hell? You mean I'm food? You're eating me? Oh, so dramatic. I'm barely taking a few years off your lifetime. You won't even notice they're gone, and by that point you'll have other issues anyway. So you won't even remember this little conversation we're having. His voice was far too cheery for my liking. Oh, sorry, I forgot how touchy you people are. I thought about his words for a while before speaking. There didn't seem to be much point in conversing with the cabin, since he seemed to know my whole train of thought anyway. I reminded myself to be kind when thinking about him. "That would be very nice of you," he reinforced, "but I'll understand if you start to hate me in a few weeks. That last guy was really sweet in the beginning, but you should have heard the nasty things he was calling me yesterday, just before you let him out." "Let him out?" I asked. "Well, yes. You opened up the front door, which released the back, kind of like the system you humans have. Did you know that eating actually stimulates the urge to?" "Yes, I've heard that disgusting fact before." "How do you know so much about everything?" This time the cabin took a few seconds before replying, as if thinking about how to phrase his response, or perhaps to remind himself not to say too much. "Whenever I receive a new guest, I have the ability to access your memories, all of them, and with much better recall than you humans. It's given me extraordinary insights into your kind." "What are you?" I found myself asking without even thinking too hard about the question. It just sort of slipped out. Such discussions are lengthy and complicated and tend to distress your kind. I would prefer that we leave it as we have thus far. I am the cabin, and you are my occupant. Sorry for using that other word, the P word. I understand now that this is a sensitive comparison, but it seemed apt. "How many guests have you had?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Oh, quite a few actually. As I'm sure you are aware from the internet message boards, as rule number 1 states, you are required to share about this place once you leave, and you don't even have to lie about it." I thought back to the posts about the cabin. None of them had been positive, and yet I'd still come here. It was almost as if the bad things people said had turned it into even more of a dare, a dangerous expedition not meant for beginners, and I had convinced myself it was a great idea to come here against all of the advice. This was all so strange, and yet it was happening to me. I just had to get through it. It occurred to me suddenly that I hadn't attempted the doors yet. "Oh yeah, don't forget to do that," the voice said. "They always try the doors. You'd probably be mad at yourself if you didn't at least try." It was infuriating how he could read my mind, even when I was trying to foil his plans to eat me. I tried the doors, of course. They didn't work. Both deadbolts could be forced across to the unlock position, but once there they would draw back into place quickly, as if being pulled by a powerful magnet. I had to use a lot of effort to keep them open, and even then, the doors wouldn't budge. "Let me out," I screamed. "I'll find you somebody else to eat, okay? I'll bring you some fish or something." "No can do, Caleb. Sorry, that's just not how it works. It's not how you want it to work. You're deciding the rules, making them up as you go along? Nah, just look at how old that list is. Super ancient looking, right? You're such a liar, you just made them up, probably specifically for me. What was the last guy like? Really into creepypasta stories or something?" "Oh yeah, unbelievably so. He actually narrates them. His audience must be really pissed that he disappeared for so long." His answers were starting to annoy me. I stopped asking questions as a result. Instead, I went into the pantry, pulled out a can of ravioli and some wooden utensils, and got the fire going. It didn't take much effort, and once again, there was a tall stack of wood beside the fireplace, ready to burn. It had all been replaced while I was sleeping the night before. One of my high school science lessons suddenly came to mind, something about how energy cannot be created or destroyed. I realized then that the cabin was consuming me. It didn't give up any part of itself for my benefit, which meant that somehow, by burning the wood, I was burning up little portions of myself. My energy, my life force, my soul, whatever you want to call it. I was feeding it piece by piece into the fireplace, like cutting off little hunks of my own flesh and feeding it to a monster. But a cold snap had come through, and it was too frigid to keep it unlit, so I continued to feed the fire, hating myself for every log and scrap of wood I put inside the stove, knowing I was doing just what he wanted. I threw log after log into the fire, trying to think of ways to get out of this place. The voice was blessedly silent as I went through my options. Finally, after several hours of pondering on the problem, I realized I didn't have any options. I would just have to wait for the next person to come along and let me out, and when that happened, I would have to be ready. I got my supplies set up by the back door like a go bag. I would need all of my provisions to get back to my car alive, but I was not going to take anything from the pantry. Hell no, no way. That stuff was cursed, and it belonged here with this place. Actually, I realized even this place didn't belong here at all. That was why there was no record of it beyond a few years ago. The posts online that compared it to a parasite were the most apt, since that was what it was. It was like a leech, surviving out here by feeding off the surrounding wilderness and the people who came inside. That was why everything around here looked so bleak and desolate. If it stayed here, that would only get worse. That decay would just continue to spread and grow more and more malevolent. This thing was a cancer. However it had gotten here, whether it had come from another dimension or another planet, it did not belong in this wilderness. It was going to destroy the park, and it would continue to spread even beyond that. I had to. I don't like this train of thought, Caleb. We've been getting along so well. You don't need to have thoughts like that about me. In fact, I'm going to have to demand that you don't. The temperature in the cabin began to plunge rapidly. Suddenly, I was shivering from the cold, clutching myself and climbing into my sleeping bag, which was crusted with ice. I can make life for you here very unpleasant if you want to continue thinking thoughts like that. I'm sorry, I managed to say through chattering teeth. I'll stop. A few agonizing seconds later, the temperature began to return to normal inside the cabin. I breathed a sigh of relief, but it took me a long, long time to feel warm again. Don't cross me, the voice said ominously. Trust me, you do not want to see me when I'm angry. That was enough to convince me not to try anything for a long while as I waited anxiously for another unsuspecting guest to arrive. The hours passed slowly with nothing to do inside the cabin. Gradually, my battery ran out on my cell phone, and my reserve power banks became depleted, leaving me with nothing to do but wait. I sat there, wishing I had brought a book with me or some form of entertainment, but I had nothing. I was becoming increasingly exasperated by the mind, numbing hours stuck inside the cabin. Even the windows were blocked by boards, so there was no way to see outside to get a view of the wilderness. All I had to look at was the wood grain of the cabin all around me. A living prison meant to look like a cottage, the inside of an alien or an entity from another dimension, eager to consume everything it could obtain. I can't tell you how many days I sat there waiting for someone to come and rescue me or to come inside the cabin and take my place. I lost track after a while. The days seemed to last forever, and the nights took even longer, and I had no sense of time because of the lack of windows. My only clue as to the hour was the pounding on the windows and doors every night at 3 a.m., waking me from my sleep. Most of the time, they were always angry and insistent, but never as bad as that first night when the things outside had tried so desperately to get in. With nothing but time, I thought about that night more and more. It occurred to me that that had been the closest to being nervous I'd ever seen this entity. It had been so insistent that I do what the list said, desperate almost. The question lingered in the back of my mind, but I was always afraid to ponder it too carefully, scared that the cabin would notice and get angry. The rules stated that I should not open the doors between the hours of 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., but did that mean that I could open the doors during these hours? What exactly would happen if I broke the rules? I think close to a month had passed by the time I made up my mind. During that time, I'd been subtly testing the boundaries set in place by the entity which now controlled my life. I had learned to guard my thoughts by that point, something I had developed through trial and error, finding out the hard way how to disguise my intentions and my goals. It's hard to explain, but I created a movie of memories that I played on a loop, as if to soothe myself with it, but just below that, just beneath the surface, was my plan, slowly developing and hidden in my subconscious. Don't ask me how I developed this skill, since it's not something I could teach, but human beings are very good at adapting to face problems. It's one of the biggest things we have going for our species, and I knew the cabin couldn't see my plan because if he could, he would have killed me. I know this because that's exactly what I planned to do to him. It was 3 a.m. when the pounding on the doors and windows began again, routine as clockwork. The voice had been quiet lately, seeming satisfied with the long-lasting meal I was providing. Instead of gloating, he had been content to wait silently for his pet to be exchanged for a new one, but I wasn't going to give him that opportunity. That night I had left a pile of trash out near my sleeping bag, including disposable utensils, open cans of beans and ravioli, and half-empty bottles of water and lamp oil. Part of me had expected him to say something, but another part figured he wouldn't, since he thought so little of the human race. He probably assumed I had just forgotten the rules again. He cleared his throat as if annoyed that I left out the trash. Getting a bit sloppy, aren't we, Caleb? He mocked. I grumbled and groaned, taking my time getting out of bed. My thoughts played a loop of good memories, camping and fishing with my family and friends. My plan sat just underneath the surface, and I tried desperately not to let it rise up to my conscious thoughts. The more I tried not to think about it, the harder it got, like when someone tells you not to picture a white polar bear. "What is that?" the voice said, sounding suspicious. "What's what?" I asked, making a show of picking up the disgusting cans filled with grubs. The pounding on the doors was growing louder, more insistent. The windows and doors were shaking in their frames. "You need to hurry up. They're going to get inside," the voice said, more urgently now, and could I detect a hint of fear in there as well? Yes, I thought I could. "Oops," I said, dropping the can, spilling bugs and ravioli everywhere. One of the grubs disappeared between the cracks in the floorboards. "Get the cans in the damn fireplace already!" "Those grubs are everywhere." I can feel them in my... Yuck, did one of them go down my crack? "Oh, sorry," I said, yawning, still half asleep. I reached down slowly, picking up one of the cans, and tossed it towards the fireplace I missed. Damn, usually I'm good at that. The termites were spreading from the wooden utensils, marching across the floorboards and going everywhere, just as I had suspected they would. Spiders were emerging from the water bottles, and beetles lumbered up and out of the lamp oil. "Oh, I see what you're doing. I see your little trick, the little game you're playing in your mind," the voice said, turning my blood cold. Suddenly it was all out in the open. I couldn't stop it now. The whole plan spilled into my conscious mind, and I ran towards the front door just as the temperature in the cabin began to rise. Instead of getting cold this time, it got very, very hot inside the cabin. The fire in the stove began to roar, burning brighter and brighter. It was suddenly sweltering in there, my clothes instantly drenched in sweat. I tried to grab the deadbolt latch, but it was glowing red hot. The instant it touched my skin, it began to sizzle. The entity began to laugh as fire spread from the stove, burning up the insects and the cans, exterminating them in an instant. "You think you can outsmart me?" it laughed. "You're trapped here forever. You're never getting out. You are my pet now, just like all the others." And then I heard them, the voices from outside, but also inside somehow. Their spirits were trapped in here, but their bodies were still outside. "Let us in," they cried. "It's so cold without our spirits, please." And that was when I remembered my pocket knife. The trusty blade was always with me through every journey. It was like an extra limb and had saved my ass more than once. I pulled the knife out from my pants pocket, my hands slick with sweat. I opened up the knife and used it to pry against the red, hot steel of the deadbolt. The blade began to heat up and turn red as well, and I knew I would only have seconds before it became unbearable to hold. The forces working against me were stronger than ever now, knowing what I was attempting to do. I fought with every ounce of strength I had, desperately levering the knife against the lock. Finally, with surprising speed, the door flung open. The blade cut my hand badly as the undead rushed inside. They moved past me without a glance in my direction. They had only one goal in mind. I grabbed my backpack and went out the door as the things began to stomp out the flames overspilling the stove. Then they began to tear the place apart with their bare hands. They started with the pantry, spilling cans and garbage everywhere that quickly sprouted termites and disgusting larvae that grew instantly into full-sized adult roaches, ants, beetles, and grubs. Then the dead began to pull the shutters down from the windows, letting in the light. A howling roar of agony and anger began to rise up, growing louder and louder inside my mind as I stumbled outside. The cabin began to bellow, cursing in an alien tongue. That voice in my head was so loud and so outraged, I couldn't listen to it for another instant. I threw my supplies into my canoe and launched off into the water, and behind me, the cabin began to crumble, the timber being gnawed by bugs as the undead reclaimed the place, returning that spit of land to the wilderness and snatching it from the hands of the one who had come from another world to invade. How he got here, I'll never know. But I think we really did kill him that day, and the spirits of those he'd murdered were allowed to finally be free. I only wish I could have said the same for myself. For 3 days, I paddled across lakes and down rivers, sometimes fighting against an unnatural current which seemed intent on taking me back to the cabin. By the end of the 3rd day, I was too exhausted to paddle the canoe anymore and began letting myself drift in the water for long stretches as the rivers threatened to pull me further from my goal. I hadn't eaten in 2 days since the fish still seemed to avoid me, and there was no foraging to be had anywhere along my route. By that point, I was too tired to cast out a line or to look for mushrooms. Slowly, I began to lose the strength to continue. I began to fade away, to give up on my own survival. It didn't happen all at once. I got a second wind and a third and a fourth, but eventually I started to notice that I was moving backwards. My oar in the water was shaking with my hands, and I couldn't bring myself to paddle even one more stroke. I let the current take me wherever it was headed, no longer able to muster the energy to even open my eyes. The canoe began to drift, and with it, so did my mind. On the morning of the 4th day traveling back, I lost consciousness completely and woke up in the water. My canoe was drifting away from me with all my gear inside. I looked up at the blue sky above, the clouds moving in and threatening rain, and I let myself be swallowed up by the lake. There was no energy left in me to fight, no strength to swim. The light above began to fade, and the darkness of the depths closed in around me. My lungs screamed for air, but my arms had no strength left in them. I sank as if the weight of 100 stones were tied around my ankles. I would have died right then and there if not for a hand which reached into the water and grabbed my wrist, pulling me up and out of the chilly lake. At first I tried to fight against it, my mind flashing back to that entity in the cabin, thinking somehow it had come back for me. He had come back for me. He wasn't going to let me die. He wanted to torment me forever. It occurred to me that perhaps I never left that place. Maybe this was all in my mind, and I was still there in that loathsome place, feeding my soul to the fire to quench the hunger of that monster. But then that strong hand grasped my wrist and pulled me up into the fresh air, and I saw with complete surprise that it was a park ranger. The familiarity of his face began to register in my mind, and I realized who he was. This was the same man who I had internally mocked and despised during my first day at the park. The guy, Elliot had been his name, had been so kind and had offered me advice and safety tips, and in my head I had just been wishing he was dead, wishing he would leave me alone. I had wanted so desperately to be alone, but now I was glad I wasn't. I was glad he was here, pulling me up by the seat of my pants and hauling me into his canoe. For a few seconds, I just lay there on the floor of the canoe, soaking wet and staring at him. We were both panting from exhaustion as we locked eyes and waited for the other to speak. "Man, you're one lucky son of a gun," he said finally, his face grave and unsmiling. "Noticed your car was still in the parking lot after your camping permit expired." I had the day off, so I figured I'd come out and look for you, see if you needed a hand. I coughed up a lungful of water and gave the most sincere thank you I could muster under the circumstances. Good thing you didn't stray too far from your campsite, he said. I was about to turn back in a minute. Looking around, I saw the familiar landscape and the island I had set up my tent on 8 days ago. 8 days that felt like a lifetime. It had taken me a week and a day to travel to and from the cabin, not including the time I was trapped there. Like I said, I lost track of the days after a while, but I knew it must have been more than a month for me, at least. And yet, when I asked Elliot what the date was, he told me again that only 8 days had passed altogether, as if my time in that cabin didn't count, or maybe time in there is just different. Now I understand why the posts online had been so insistent, so forceful in their pleas that no one should ever visit the cabin. I had wondered why they even shared about it in the first place if they didn't want others to go, but now I know. Now I understand. The cabin forces you to do it. It makes you share about the place, just like I'm sharing about it now, even though every part of me knows I shouldn't. It still exerts its control over me and over them, and now I know why that is. He got under my skin, I guess you could say. The cabin infected me somehow. It really is like a parasite that latches onto you if you go inside. Every time I ate something from that pantry, I was taking in a little bit more of its dark presence, inviting it into myself like an unclean spirit. I'm glad I escaped. I really am. But I sometimes worry about what might have escaped with me. What if I brought a little piece of it home with me, and now it's incubating inside of me, growing? I've started hearing voices in my head again, and it's not just one. There's thousands of them,